much more striking, because if you go to the hinterland villages, you don't find people starving or living in subhuman conditions, which you can find just opening your office in Mumbai and looking down. So very clearly, one of the root causes of any form of instability or insecure environment is basically people who have nothing to lose. How do you control people who have nothing to lose? That's one point. The second point, and this was a discussion that Vijay and I were having yesterday, is some elements of these security they need to stem from awareness, from general gyan, because otherwise, I mean, by any stretch of imagination, I think the audience sitting over here would comprise of very well-educated Indian citizens. And yet, if I were to ask a general question, this is not even a GK question, that, India has got 608 districts, okay? How many of those districts do you think are affected by the Naxalite problem? And if I ask anyone to pick out a number, any numbers? Any guesses? So, out of 608, last count is about 175 districts, which is close to 20% of the Indian mainland is being affected by the Naxalite violence. Now, you can't say that I am a citizen of India, I am the educated strata of India, I am in the leadership position of the corporate of India, and this is not my problem. Sarkar will deal with it. Sarkar can't deal with it. Sarkar is at its, I don't know if you are aware, first time after our independence, the Indian Air Force is being used to quell the Naxalite projects. Our own Air Force, which will be shelling our own citizens. It's the first time it's happened though. It's happened once in Nagaland, but other than that, this is the first time. So obviously this is a magnitude, a seriousness of a magnitude, which we can't afford to ignore anymore and say that, let me try and get license prices low and that's the end of my, agenda. The last point I think is, and I'll give you a practical example also as to how organizations are doing it, and there's a very good example of Unilever. Unilever operates in Assam, where they get a business benefit because they operate in Assam. They get about 30% tax SOPs for the next 10 or 12 years. And they had a major problem there because the Ulfa insurgents would constantly threaten them, ask them for money, and actually about 2.5 years ago they had a rocket attack into their officers' quarters. A rocket was fired into it, and a proper armor-piercing rocket. And obviously the first reaction was to ask for more army, more troops and all of that stuff, and they did that. But they did something much more interesting after that. They started teaching English and computers in about 50 villages all around that factory. Now it's weird, you'd say that what has that got to do with security, because security typically you need to call for more CRPF, more Assam rifles. Now what has started happening though, is that in these villages, the children, they go to learn English and computers, and for the family of those children, this is considered to be salvation. Angrezi seekh lega, computer seekh lega, yahan is narak se nikal. That's the philosophy they have got. And very recently, about 6 odd months ago, there was an incident where a woman from a village, she took a dha, that traditional knife, and she put it on the neck of one of the insurgents who had come into that village for harboring in the night, and said, if you mess with Unilever, I'll chop off your head. Because she sees this man now messing with the future of her kid. Now this defense in depth that Unilever has managed to create around, it's a very strong business need. I mean, there's huge ROI. They can't say we are doing computer training just for the feel-good factor. They're doing it for survival, which cannot be achieved by just troops. And there is this whole belief that I see in a lot of Indian mindset that somehow the army and the paramilitary forces will take care of this problem. They won't, because let me assure you one thing, the paramilitary and the army are actually on the have-not side. Bulk of the troops who come into the armed forces come from the same community which are in the have-not side, not in the have side. So if a push comes to a shove, they are actually on the other side. So let's be clear on that. So I think these aspects, if we start identifying in our own communities, whether it's, I'm privy to the fact that many organizations are already doing it in their own communities, which is basically helping create the best way to solve terrorist problem, as it's a known fact in the world, is to give the terrorist something to lose. If he has nothing to lose, he's the most dangerous terrorist. There's nothing to lose. He's happy to tie up. I mean, how many of you got burnt ever in your hand? And I'm sure all of us have. Hurts, right? Hurts a lot. Imagine the agony that a person would have gone through for him to strap explosives on his body to come and blow you up. Imagine what extent of pushing the community, the society must have done to him for him to do that. So quite obviously, using force is not the answer there. The answer lies in corporates assuming some of those responsibilities and saying, at least in our own circles, the Unilever model, in this radius of 50 kilometers, we will do what it takes in our business requirement to try and educate the people, to try and give them a better chance, a better shot at life. Because if we don't do that now, and let me tell you this, the government is not going to do it. The politicians, if I ask you a question here, and I've done this with several people in the past, I'll ask you a question, I can assure you this is the first time, if you have heard this question for the first time, you would have thought of it when I ask you this question. If I ask you in your organization, how many Hindu, Muslims, Sikh, Christians do you have? My guess is you would have never thought of this question before. Politicians live by this question every day. This is what they live by. They slice and dice and divide. They are not going to solve this problem. Bureaucrats can't solve this problem because there aren't enough of them and they have tenure. The reason why you know this guy Sridharan is because there is only one of him. You can't name 5 Sridharans. So the only people who can now do this in a meaningful fashion are corporates. And it's not such a revolutionary thing. I mean, corporates have created cities to look after their employees, right? So I'm just saying that maybe we should start looking at corporates creating environments to look after their customers who happen to be citizens of India. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, Raghu.
Thank you, Captain. I'd just like to add a slightly different view. While I agree with what the panelists have said on one dimension, I just want to add a filter of a different lens, which is one of, it has 2 dimensions. One is of priority, and the second is of connectivity to the trends that we're talking about. And let me explain both of those in a few minutes. For priority, let me take you back to a small story when I was learning how to fly in Chicago, and I was overwhelmed by how much a pilot in a little single-engine Cessna has to do. He or she has to fly the plane, you have a map on your hand, you're doing point-to-point navigation between one point here and another 15 nautical miles somewhere else. You're looking at landmarks on the ground. You're looking out for other aircraft because it's visual flight rules, etc., etc. And I asked my instructor, and this was before I got my license, I said, Mark, what do I do? And he was flying the Cessna and I was in the other seat. He said, Vijay, remember the priority, aviate, navigate, communicate. And I said, why? He said, well, first thing you got to do is fly the down plane, because if you aren't flying the plane, there's going to be no navigation to do and you won't have to communicate with them and you'll be dead. The second is, when you're flying the plane, you got to know where you're going. Yeah? And the third is, while you're going there, make sure you're communicating with aircraft around you and with the controllers so that they know where you are and where you're going, so that the chances of an accident are less. So that's the first thing, that as a CIO community, I think we can't lose sight of the fact of what our primary responsibility is, which is that of a Chief Information Officer, which means do whatever has to be done inside the IT function as a leader of that function to enable the business to grow, thrive, be number 1 in its competitive arena, cut costs, all of the above. And that goes back to that point that I said the other day about the expanded shoulders, where we should not be looking at IT just as technology and the hardware and the software. It's 5 dimensions. It's the dimension of technology, which is our hardware and our networks and our routers and all of that stuff. It is the dimension of the applications, which is the software, and whether software is a service or cloud or whatever it is, but the applications. The third is the data, which is the master data, the transactional data, which is what drives the business. The fourth is one of the most important, which is business process, which is the re-engineering and how do we bring efficiencies into organizations and change the way they do business so that they actually thrive in their industries. And the last is the organizational governance of the IT function and of the rest of the business through IT. We need to master our areas of responsibility along these 5 dimensions while having an eye to the trends that the eminent panelists have mentioned. And this brings me to my second point, which is keep an eye out for the trends. So everything that Dr. Ramani mentioned, that Homi has mentioned, that Captain Raman has mentioned, is true. It's happening. It's a very frightening world we live in, and we have to do more. But I think it's important to excel in the first arena and keep an eye out to the second, because if we try and solve even 1% of the second, with major gaps in the first, we will fail in both. We'll fail in the second, and we will certainly fail in our immediate responsibilities.